Picture this. Somewhere in the misty forests of northern Europe, around the 2nd century of the Common Era, a group of Germanic warriors sits around a crackling fire. They're discussing their future, their children's future, and the growing pressures that threaten their way of life. Little do they know that their descendants will one day sail across the Mediterranean Sea, capture the eternal city of Rome itself, and rule an empire stretching from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the deserts of Libya. These are the Vandals, and their story is nothing like what you think you know about them. When you hear the word Vandal today, you probably think of graffiti artists or people who destroy property. But the real Vandals were something far more extraordinary. They were master strategists, skilled diplomats, and innovative rulers who built one of the most successful kingdoms in the post-Roman world. Their name probably comes from an old Germanic word meaning to wander, and wander they certainly did. But this wasn't aimless wandering. This was one of the most calculated, ambitious, and ultimately successful migrations in human history. Over the course of 2 centuries, these Germanic peoples would travel from the Baltic shores to the sun-baked cities of North Africa, transforming themselves from tribal warriors into Mediterranean kings. To understand how remarkable this transformation was, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the cold forests and river valleys where the Vandal story first began. In the early centuries of the Common Era, the region we now call Poland and Eastern Germany was home to various Germanic tribes living in a culture that archaeologists call the Przeworsk culture. These weren't the savage barbarians that Roman propaganda would later describe. Recent archaeological discoveries, including warrior graves found as recently as 2024 near the village of Glinka in Poland, reveal a sophisticated society with advanced metalworking, complex burial practices, and extensive trade networks. The Vandals emerged from this world as 2 main tribal groups, the Hasdingi and the Silingi. They lived in fortified settlements, practiced both agriculture and animal husbandry, and maintained trading relationships that connected them to the broader European economy. Their society was organized around warrior bands led by kings and war chiefs, but these weren't absolute monarchs. Instead, they were leaders who had proven themselves in battle and council, ruling with the consent of their warrior followers. What made Vandal society particularly interesting was the role of women. Unlike in many ancient societies, Vandal women enjoyed considerable rights and freedoms. They could own property, participate in important decisions, and held positions of respect within their communities. This would later prove significant when the Vandals established their kingdom in Africa and needed to govern diverse populations. Religion played a crucial role in early Vandal society. Like most Germanic peoples, they worshipped gods associated with war, fertility, and the natural world. Their religious practices included elaborate burial ceremonies, ritual feasting, and the veneration of ancestral spirits. These flexible religious traditions would later help them adapt to Christianity during their migrations. But the world of the early Vandals was not peaceful. Population growth was putting pressure on available resources, while climate change was making agriculture more difficult. Most importantly, other peoples were moving, creating a domino effect of migration that would eventually reach the Vandals themselves. The Great Vandal Migration began not with conquest, but with survival. In the late 2nd century, pressure from other Germanic peoples, particularly the Goths, forced Vandal groups to begin moving southward from their Baltic homeland. This wasn't a single, coordinated exodus. Instead, it was a series of migrations spanning several generations, as different Vandal groups moved along the great river valleys that served as highways through the European landscape. The logistics of these migrations were staggering. Entire communities, including warriors, craftsmen, farmers, women, children, and elderly, participated in these movements. They had to organize supply chains, establish temporary settlements, negotiate passage through other people's territories, and maintain military readiness while protecting vulnerable civilian populations. As they moved south, the Vandals encountered other displaced peoples and absorbed them into their ranks. This process of incorporation was crucial to their later success. The Alans, an Iranian-speaking nomadic group also fleeing pressure from the east, became particularly important allies. The alliance between the Vandals and Alans would prove so significant that later Vandal kings would style themselves as rulers of both peoples. The Suebi, another Germanic confederation, also joined the migrating Vandals. These various groups brought different skills and traditions to the growing confederation. The Alans contributed superior horsemanship and cavalry techniques, while the Suebi added additional manpower and their own warrior traditions. This diversity was a source of strength. Rather than remaining a single tribe, the Vandals were becoming a multi-ethnic confederation united under Vandal leadership, but drawing on the strengths of multiple peoples. This flexibility would later prove essential to their ability to conquer and rule the sophisticated provinces of Roman Africa. The journey south took the Vandals through the heart of Europe, along routes that would later become major medieval trade highways. They passed through modern-day Czech Republic, Austria, and southern Germany, sometimes fighting their way through, sometimes negotiating passage, sometimes finding temporary refuge in territories allied with Rome. During these migrations, the Vandals demonstrated the adaptability that would characterize their entire history. Unlike many Germanic tribes that maintained purely hostile relationships with Rome, the Vandals showed remarkable flexibility in their strategies. Sometimes they raided across the frontier, sometimes they served as Roman allies, and sometimes they negotiated for settlement rights within Roman territory. This flexibility reflected a sophisticated understanding of political realities. The Vandals learned to play Roman factions against each other, to exploit Roman civil wars for their own benefit, and to present themselves as valuable allies when it served their purposes. They were developing skills in diplomacy and political maneuvering that would serve them well in their later conquests. The Marcomannic Wars of the late 2nd century provided the Vandals with their first major opportunity to interact significantly with the Roman world. While other Germanic tribes bore the brunt of Roman military attention, Vandal groups operated along the periphery of these conflicts, sometimes as Roman allies, sometimes as independent actors pursuing their own objectives. During these conflicts, Vandal warriors who served as Roman auxiliaries learned Latin, adopted Roman military equipment, and observed Roman administrative practices. This knowledge would prove invaluable in their later conquests and kingdom-building efforts. They were not just fighting Romans, they were learning from them. The 3rd century marked a crucial period in Vandal development. This was the time of the crisis of the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under the weight of civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic crisis. For the Vandals, this crisis represented unprecedented opportunity. As Roman legions were withdrawn from the frontiers to fight in civil wars, vast stretches of formerly Roman territory became available for settlement. The Vandals, along with other Germanic peoples, began moving into these areas, sometimes invited by Roman commanders seeking allies, sometimes taking them by force. During this period, the Vandals began to encounter Christianity in significant numbers. Roman prisoners, traders, and missionaries brought the new religion into Vandal communities, where it began to take root alongside traditional Germanic beliefs. This early exposure to Christianity would have profound consequences for later Vandal history. The late 3rd and early 4th centuries saw the Vandals becoming increasingly sophisticated in their political and military organization. They developed more complex hierarchical structures, with kings ruling over sub-kings and war chiefs. They improved their metallurgical techniques, producing better weapons and armor. Most importantly, they began to develop a sense of collective identity that transcended their original tribal divisions. By the dawn of the 4th century, the Vandals had established themselves as one of the major barbarian confederations along the Roman frontier. They controlled substantial territories in what is now Hungary and Romania, maintained diplomatic relations with both the Western and Eastern Roman empires, and had begun to develop the administrative and military capabilities that would serve them well in their later conquests. But this carefully constructed world was about to be shattered by events beyond their control. The arrival of the Huns under Attila changed everything for the Germanic peoples of Eastern Europe. The Huns were a nomadic confederation from the Asian steppes, and they possessed military technology and tactics that proved devastatingly effective against traditional Germanic warfare. Their composite bows could outrange Germanic weapons, their cavalry could outmaneuver Germanic infantry, and their psychological warfare created panic among their enemies. For the Vandals, the Hunnic arrival presented an existential crisis. Their established territories along the Danube suddenly became untenable as Hunnic raiders swept through the region with unprecedented speed and violence. The Vandals faced a stark choice: submit to Hunnic domination, fight a hopeless war against superior forces, or abandon their homeland entirely and seek new territories elsewhere. Different Vandal groups made different choices. Some submitted to Hunnic overlordship, contributing warriors to Attila's growing empire. Others fought desperate defensive actions, trying to protect their ancestral lands against impossible odds. But the majority, led by visionary kings whose names would echo through history, chose the path of migration. This decision required extraordinary courage and leadership. Abandoning established territories meant leaving behind not just physical possessions, but also ancestral burial grounds, tribal shrines, and the accumulated history of generations. It meant venturing into unknown territories, facing unknown enemies, and risking the complete destruction of their people. The man who would lead the Vandals on this perilous journey was King Gaiseric. Historical records about his early reign are fragmentary, but what we know suggests he was a ruler of exceptional vision and capability, able to unite the fractured Vandal groups under single leadership and convince them to undertake one of the most ambitious migrations in history. The Great Vandal Exodus began around 401 CE, as Gaiseric led his people westward across the frozen rivers of Central Europe. This wasn't a simple military campaign, but a folk migration involving tens of thousands of people. Warriors, craftsmen, farmers, women, children, and elderly all participated in this massive undertaking, along with their livestock, possessions, and tribal treasures. Think about the logistics of such an operation. The Vandals had to organize supply chains, establish temporary settlements, negotiate passage through other people's territories, and maintain military readiness while protecting a vulnerable civilian population. They developed sophisticated systems for managing these challenges, including advanced scouting parties, rear guards, and specialized units responsible for foraging and supply. The journey west took the Vandals through the heart of Europe, along routes that would later become major medieval trade highways. They passed through modern-day Czech Republic, Austria, and southern Germany, learning about the lands and peoples they encountered while constantly adapting their strategies to new challenges. One of the most significant moments in early Vandal history came when they reached the Rhine frontier. The Rhine was more than just a river. It was a symbol of Roman power, lined with fortifications and patrolled by some of Rome's best troops. It had protected Gaul from barbarian invasion for centuries. On December 31st, 406 CE, the Vandals, along with their Alan and Swabi allies, crossed the frozen Rhine near Mainz. This crossing has become legendary in historical accounts, representing the moment when the barbarian migrations truly began to threaten the Roman heartland. The crossing was opposed by Roman forces, including Frankish federates fighting for Rome. The battle that followed was fierce and bloody, with many casualties on both sides. But the barbarian confederation proved too strong for the Roman defenders, and once across the Rhine, they found the wealthy provinces of Gaul spread out before them. The Vandal invasion of Gaul was characterized by both destruction and adaptation. Like most barbarian groups, they engaged in extensive raiding, seeking portable wealth that could support their migrating population. Cities were besieged, villas were plundered, and Roman administrative structures collapsed in the face of barbarian pressure. But the Vandals also showed their characteristic adaptability. In some areas, they negotiated agreements with local Roman authorities, offering protection in exchange for supplies and tribute. In others, they established temporary settlements where they could rest and regroup. Throughout this period, they were learning about Roman administrative practices, military techniques, and political structures. The 3-year passage through Gaul, from 407 to 409, was a formative period for the Vandal Confederation. They encountered the full wealth and complexity of Roman civilization, gaining first-hand experience of urban life, sophisticated agriculture, and complex trade networks. Many Vandals learned Latin, adopted Roman customs, and began to envision possibilities beyond simple raiding and migration. More importantly, they encountered Christianity in its various forms. Gaul was one of the most thoroughly Christianized provinces of the Roman Empire, and the Vandals came into contact with both Orthodox Catholics and various other Christian groups, including Arians. This religious diversity would later influence their own religious choices in ways that would define their kingdom for centuries. The passage through Gaul also demonstrated the military effectiveness of the Vandal Confederation. They proved capable of besieging fortified cities, defeating Roman armies in open battle, and maintaining their cohesion despite the constant pressures of warfare and migration. By the time they approached the Pyrenees, they had become one of the most formidable barbarian forces in Europe. The crossing into Iberia in 409 marked the beginning of a new phase in Vandal history. No longer were they simply migrating refugees seeking new homes. They were becoming conquerors with territorial ambitions, political sophistication, and a growing understanding of how to rule settled populations. The Vandal conquest of Iberia revealed the full extent of their evolution from Germanic tribesmen to sophisticated political actors. The division of Iberian territories among the various barbarian groups was accomplished through a combination of warfare and negotiation. The Hasdingi Vandals settled primarily in Gaiseric, while the Silingi Vandals established themselves in Boeotia, the wealthy southern province that included cities like Seville and Córdoba. This geographical division reflected sophisticated political thinking. The Vandals weren't simply seizing whatever territory they could hold. They were making strategic choices based on economic potential, defensive advantages, and access to trade routes. Gaiseric provided access to Atlantic shipping, while Boeotia controlled the agricultural wealth of southern Iberia and crucial trade connections with North Africa. The establishment of Vandal control in Iberia also demonstrated their growing administrative capabilities. Rather than simply ruling through force, they began to develop hybrid systems that combined Germanic traditions with Roman administrative practices. They maintained many Roman laws and customs while adapting them to Vandal needs and values. This period saw the emergence of a distinctly Vandal approach to ruling Roman populations. Unlike some barbarian groups that either displaced Roman inhabitants or maintained complete separation from them, the Vandals began developing integrated systems of governance. Roman landowners who submitted to Vandal authority often kept their properties. Roman administrators continued to serve in government roles, and Roman legal traditions remained largely intact. It was also during this period that the Vandals adopted Arian Christianity as their official religion. Arianism, which taught that Christ was subordinate to God the Father, had been declared heretical by the Council of Nicaea in 325, but it remained popular among many Germanic peoples. The Vandal adoption of Arianism wasn't simply a matter of religious preference. It was a political statement that distinguished them from the Roman Catholic populations they ruled while connecting them to other Germanic kingdoms that had made similar choices. Arianism became a marker of Vandal identity and a tool for maintaining group cohesion in the face of Roman cultural pressure. However, the Vandal occupation of Iberia wasn't unopposed. Roman resistance continued throughout their time on the peninsula, and the most serious challenge came from Roman general Constantius, who launched a major campaign to recover Iberian territory around 416. This campaign initially focused on the Silingi Vandals in Boeotia, who found themselves caught between Roman forces and hostile local populations. The destruction of the Silingi Vandal kingdom was a watershed moment in Vandal history. The surviving Silingi were absorbed into the Hasdingi Confederation under King Gaiseric, creating a more unified Vandal identity while demonstrating the constant threats they faced from Roman reconquest efforts. This experience taught the Vandals important lessons about the limitations of land-based power in a world where Rome still controlled most Mediterranean sea routes. They began to develop new strategies that would eventually lead them to Africa and naval dominance. But before we continue with their journey, we need to meet the man who would transform the Vandals from a regional kingdom into a Mediterranean superpower. The death of King Gaiseric in 428 brought his half-brother to power, and with him began the most dramatic phase of Vandal history. His name was Gaiseric, also known as Gaiseric or Genseric, and he was one of the most remarkable rulers of the 5th century. Ancient sources report that he was the illegitimate son of a Vandal king, but he was raised as the equal of his legitimate brothers and proved himself through his cunning and brilliant military tactics. Gaiseric's accession to power came at a crucial moment. Roman pressure on the remaining Vandal territories in Iberia was intensifying, and it was becoming clear that their position on the peninsula was ultimately untenable. Gaiseric faced the choice that had confronted his people repeatedly throughout their history: submit to Roman authority, fight a hopeless war, or find new territories where Vandal power could flourish. His decision to cross to Africa was one of the most audacious strategic moves in ancient history. Africa was the wealthiest and most important of Rome's remaining provinces, the source of grain that fed the city of Rome itself, and the center of a sophisticated urban civilization that had thrived for centuries. It was also heavily fortified and defended by Roman armies that had never been seriously challenged by barbarian invasion. Legend has it that Gaiseric received an invitation from Bonifacius, the Roman governor of Africa, who was involved in a complex dispute with the imperial court and apparently requested Vandal military assistance against his political enemies. Whether this invitation was genuine or later fabricated by Roman historians seeking to explain the catastrophic loss of Africa remains debated, but it gave Gaiseric the pretext he needed for invasion. The Vandal crossing to Africa in 429 CE represents one of the most significant moments in the decline of the Western Roman Empire. According to the historian Procopius, the Vandals numbered exactly 80,000 people, though this figure might be symbolic or represent only the adult male population. The logistics of transporting an entire people across the Strait of Gibraltar were staggering. The crossing itself required extensive preparation and coordination. The Vandals had to secure ships, organize supply lines, coordinate with possible allies in Africa, and maintain security during the vulnerable crossing period. They also had to ensure that their movement appeared to be a legitimate intervention in Roman affairs rather than an unprovoked invasion. The arrival of the Vandals in Africa caught Roman authorities largely unprepared. Despite the empire's extensive intelligence networks and diplomatic connections, the speed and scale of the Vandal crossing surprised Roman commanders. This initial surprise proved crucial to Vandal success in establishing their foothold in African territory. From their landing point, likely somewhere near modern-day Tangier, the Vandals began a systematic conquest of Roman Africa that would take nearly a decade to complete. This wasn't a simple military campaign, but a comprehensive transformation of one of Rome's most important provinces into a barbarian kingdom. Gaiseric's approach to conquest revealed the sophistication that had developed during the long years of migration. Rather than simply destroying Roman institutions, he adapted them to Vandal needs. Roman landowners who submitted to Vandal authority often retained their properties, though they had to accept Vandal overlordship and pay taxes to the new rulers. One of Gaiseric's most significant innovations was his emphasis on naval power. Unlike most Germanic rulers, who focused primarily on land-based military strength, Gaiseric understood that control of the Mediterranean required a powerful fleet. He began building and capturing ships, recruiting experienced sailors, and developing the naval capabilities that would make the Vandal kingdom a major Mediterranean power. The religious dimension of Vandal rule in Africa proved particularly significant. The province had been thoroughly Christianized for centuries, with a complex hierarchy of bishops, extensive monastic communities, and deeply rooted theological traditions. The Vandal commitment to Arian Christianity created immediate tensions with the Orthodox Catholic population they now ruled. Gaiseric's religious policies were carefully calculated to maintain Vandal identity while avoiding unnecessary conflict. Arian Christianity served as a marker of Vandal identity and a tool for maintaining group cohesion, but Gaiseric generally avoided the kind of systematic religious persecution that might provoke widespread rebellion. The conquest of individual cities revealed both Vandal military capabilities and their growing understanding of siege warfare. Cities like Hippo Regius, where St. Augustine had served as bishop, required sophisticated siege techniques that the Vandals had learned during their years of warfare in Europe. The siege of Hippo, which lasted 14 months, demonstrated Vandal persistence and tactical skill. Perhaps even more impressive was the Vandal ability to maintain their conquests against Roman attempts at reconquest. Emperor Theodosius II sent substantial military forces to recover the African provinces, but the Vandals proved capable of defeating these expeditions while continuing their own expansion. The Treaty of 435 between Gaiseric and the Western Roman Empire represented a crucial moment in the establishment of the Vandal kingdom. This agreement granted the Vandals official recognition as foederati, allied troops serving the empire, while giving them control over substantial African territories. It was a face-saving compromise for Rome, but a major political victory for Gaiseric. However, Gaiseric had no intention of limiting himself to the territories granted by the treaty. In 439, he launched a surprise attack on Carthage, the most important city in Roman Africa and one of the greatest urban centers in the Mediterranean world. The capture of Carthage transformed the Vandals from regional rulers into major players in Mediterranean politics. Carthage was more than just another conquered city. It was the administrative center of Roman Africa, the hub of trade routes that connected Europe with sub-Saharan Africa, and a symbol of Roman power that had endured for centuries. Gaiseric moved his court to the ancient city, establishing a royal palace that rivaled those of Constantinople and Ravenna. He began minting coins bearing his image, establishing diplomatic relationships with other major powers, and developing the administrative systems necessary to rule a sophisticated urban civilization. The transformation of Carthage under Vandal rule reflected the remarkable adaptability that had characterized the Vandals throughout their history. Rather than destroying the city's Roman character, they adapted it to their needs while maintaining much of its existing structure. Recent archaeological evidence shows that, contrary to earlier assumptions about Vandal destructiveness, much of Carthage's infrastructure remained intact and functional under Vandal rule. The Great Harbor continued to serve as a center for Mediterranean trade, while the city's workshops, schools, and markets continued to function under new management. Archaeological findings, including large amounts of African red slip, were discovered across the Mediterranean dating from the Vandal period, suggest that North Africa under Vandal rule was actually a time of continued economic prosperity rather than decline. The capture of Carthage also provided Gaiseric with the resources necessary to project Vandal power across the Mediterranean. The city's wealth, combined with its strategic location, made it an ideal base for the naval operations that would make the Vandal kingdom famous throughout the ancient world. The establishment of Vandal naval supremacy in the Western Mediterranean was perhaps Gaiseric's greatest achievement. The Vandal fleet was built through a combination of captured Roman vessels, newly constructed ships, and vessels obtained through alliance and purchase. Gaiseric recruited experienced sailors from throughout the Mediterranean, including Romans, Greeks, and various barbarian peoples. Vandal naval tactics combined traditional Mediterranean practices with innovations that reflected their unique strategic situation. They specialized in raids rather than formal naval battles, using their superior knowledge of North African coastlines and their network of island bases to strike at Roman targets and disappear before imperial forces could respond effectively. The psychological impact of Vandal naval raids was perhaps even more significant than their material damage. For centuries, the Mediterranean had been a Roman lake, with Roman control so complete that coastal cities rarely needed serious fortifications. The appearance of Vandal raiders shattered this sense of security, forcing Rome to rebuild coastal defenses and redirect military resources from other priorities. Sicily became one of the primary targets of Vandal naval operations. The island's strategic location, agricultural wealth, and proximity to North Africa made it an obvious objective. Vandal raids on Sicily began almost immediately after the conquest of Carthage, and by the 440s, they had established effective control over much of the island. The conquest of Sardinia and Corsica followed similar patterns. These islands provided the Vandals with additional bases for naval operations while denying them to Roman forces. More importantly, they controlled crucial shipping routes and provided access to resources that supported the growing Vandal kingdom. Perhaps the most dramatic demonstration of Vandal naval power came with their raids on the Italian coastline itself. Vandal fleets struck at ports from Naples to Genoa, capturing supplies, prisoners, and portable wealth, while demonstrating that not even the Italian peninsula was safe from their attacks. The economic impact of Vandal naval dominance was devastating for the Western Roman Empire. Trade routes that had functioned safely for centuries became dangerous, forcing merchants to pay higher insurance costs, hire armed escorts, or avoid certain areas entirely. More significantly, Vandal control of key Mediterranean routes disrupted the grain supply that fed the city of Rome. The Treaty of 442 between Gaiseric and Emperor Valentinian III represented Rome's acknowledgement of Vandal power and the empire's inability to reconquer the lost African territories. This treaty granted the Vandals official control over the richest provinces of Roman Africa, while also including provisions for intermarriage between the imperial family and Vandal royalty. By the mid-5th century, the Vandal kingdom had achieved a level of power and prosperity that would have seemed impossible during their migrations from the Germanic forests. Carthage had become one of the most important cities in the Mediterranean, rivaling Constantinople in its wealth and influence. But the high point of Vandal power was yet to come, and it would involve one of the most famous events of the 5th century, the sack of Rome itself. The events leading to the sack began with the assassination of Emperor Valentinian III in March 455. Valentinian's death created a succession crisis that Gaiseric was quick to exploit. The new emperor, Petronius Maximus, repudiated the marriage agreement between Gaiseric's son Hunneric and the imperial princess Eudocia, giving Gaiseric a perfect pretext for intervention. Gaiseric's claim that he was acting to protect the rights of the imperial family was politically brilliant. Rather than appearing as a barbarian aggressor, he presented himself as the legitimate defender of imperial honor and legal agreements. This framing helped legitimize Vandal actions while placing Roman authorities in the position of treaty breakers. The Vandal fleet's approach to Rome created panic in the city. Unlike previous barbarian invasions, which had come overland and provided some warning, the Vandal naval assault appeared suddenly from the sea. Roman authorities had little time to organize defenses or evacuate valuable items from the city. According to tradition, Pope Leo I met with Gaiseric outside Rome and persuaded him to spare the city from fire and to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Whether this meeting actually took place as described is debated by historians, but it reflects the reputation for restraint that distinguished the Vandal sack from more destructive barbarian attacks. The Vandal occupation of Rome lasted 14 days, from June 2nd to June 16th, for 155. During this period, they systematically looted the city's wealth while generally avoiding the wholesale destruction that had characterized earlier barbarian sacks. This restraint reflected Gaiseric's understanding that Rome's value lay not in its destruction, but in its wealth and symbolic importance. The treasures carried away by the Vandals included items of enormous historical significance. They took the imperial regalia, sacred vessels from the Temple of Jerusalem that had been displayed in Rome since Titus's conquest, and countless works of art and literature. More importantly for Gaiseric's long-term plans, they took the Empress Eudocia and other members of the imperial family as hostages. The psychological impact of the Vandal sack was enormous throughout the Roman world. The idea that barbarians could sail directly to Rome, occupy the Eternal City for 2 weeks, and depart with impunity shattered any remaining illusions about Roman invincibility. The wealth obtained from Rome further strengthened the Vandal kingdom's economic position. The treasures carried back to Carthage included not just gold and silver, but also works of art, religious artifacts, and technical knowledge that enhanced Vandal prestige and capabilities. Gaiseric's treatment of the imperial hostages demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of political advantage. Rather than simply holding them for ransom, he used them to legitimize Vandal claims and create ongoing political complications for his enemies. The marriage of his son Hunneric to Eudocia, finally consummated after the sack, created a dynastic connection between the Vandal royal family and the Roman imperial house. The return journey to Africa showcased Vandal naval capabilities at their peak. The fleet transported not just the looted treasures, but also thousands of Roman prisoners, including senators, craftsmen, and scholars who would contribute their skills to the Vandal kingdom. This transfer of human capital was perhaps even more valuable than the material wealth. The aftermath of the sack saw Gaiseric at the height of his diplomatic influence. Other barbarian kingdoms sought Vandal alliance and support, while the Byzantine Empire was forced to negotiate for the return of imperial family members. The Vandal kingdom had become a major player in Mediterranean politics. However, the sack also marked the beginning of more systematic Roman efforts to contain and eventually destroy Vandal power. The loss of Rome galvanized Roman resistance and provided the political justification needed for major military campaigns against the Vandal kingdom. The most serious of these came in 468, when Emperor Leo I launched a massive expedition intended to finally destroy the Vandal kingdom and restore Roman control over Africa. This undertaking involved over 1,000 ships and perhaps 100,000 men, making it one of the largest naval operations in ancient history. The financial cost was enormous, reportedly consuming the entire treasury of the Eastern Empire. The Roman expedition was commanded by Basiliscus, the brother-in-law of Emperor Leo. But Gaiseric's response to this threat demonstrated his strategic brilliance and understanding of naval warfare. Rather than meeting the Roman fleet in open battle, he used delaying tactics, diplomatic negotiations, and psychological warfare to undermine Roman morale and cohesion. When Gaiseric finally struck, it was with devastating effectiveness. The Battle of Cap Bon in 468 resulted in one of the most complete naval victories in ancient history. Gaiseric used fire ships, surprise attacks, and superior local knowledge to destroy much of the Roman fleet and capture or kill thousands of Roman soldiers. Basiliscus barely escaped with his life, and the remnants of the expedition limped back to Constantinople, having accomplished nothing. The failure of the 468 expedition effectively ended any realistic possibility of Roman reconquest of Vandal Africa. The enormous cost had bankrupted the Eastern Empire, while the psychological impact of the defeat convinced many that the Vandals were simply too powerful to be defeated by conventional means. According to historical accounts, Gaiseric was known for his unpredictable naval raids, sometimes taking personal command of expeditions with the comment, "Let God take us to those he is angry with." This apparent randomness was actually a sophisticated strategy that made it impossible for Roman forces to predict and counter Vandal attacks. One interesting detail about Gaiseric is that he may have been physically unable to ride horses due to a fall he had taken as a young man, which some historians suggest influenced his focus on naval rather than land-based warfare. Whether true or not, this story reflects how Gaiseric turned potential limitations into strategic advantages. The final years of Gaiseric's reign saw him consolidating his achievements and preparing for the succession that would test the stability of his kingdom. The peace treaty of 474 with the Eastern Roman Empire formally recognized Vandal control over their African territories while establishing diplomatic procedures for managing ongoing disputes. Gaiseric died in 477 at the advanced age of around 88, having ruled the Vandal kingdom for nearly 50 years. His death marked the end of one of the most successful barbarian careers in history and the beginning of a new phase in Vandal development. One of Gaiseric's most important innovations was his establishment of a unique system of royal succession. Unlike most Germanic kingdoms, which followed traditional inheritance patterns that often led to civil wars, Gaiseric decreed that the crown should pass to the oldest male member of the royal family. This system was designed to prevent succession disputes while ensuring that experienced leaders would rule the kingdom. The succession of Huneric in 477 represented the first test of this innovative inheritance system. As the eldest surviving male member of the royal family, Huneric's claim was clear according to his father's laws, but he faced the challenge of maintaining Vandal power without Gaiseric's exceptional capabilities. Huneric had been groomed for power throughout his father's reign, serving in military commands, diplomatic missions, and administrative roles. His marriage to the former imperial princess Eudocia provided him with legitimacy in Roman eyes, while his Vandal heritage ensured acceptance by the traditional elite. However, Huneric's reign revealed some of the underlying tensions that Gaiseric's strong leadership had kept in check. The religious divisions between Arian Vandals and Catholic Romans became more pronounced, while the economic strain of maintaining a large military and administrative apparatus began to show. Huneric's religious policies proved particularly controversial. Unlike his father, who had generally avoided systematic persecution of Catholics, Huneric launched a series of campaigns against Catholic clergy and institutions. Catholic bishops were exiled, churches were closed or converted to Arian use, and Catholic texts were burned in public ceremonies. The persecution reached its climax with the Council of Carthage in 484, where Catholic bishops were forced to debate with Arian theologians under conditions that virtually guaranteed Arian victory. These policies had significant political consequences, strengthening Catholic resistance to Vandal rule while providing the Eastern Roman Empire with propaganda ammunition for future campaigns. Hunneric died in 484 after a 7-year reign, and his death brought his nephew Gunthamund to the throne. Gunthamund's reign from 484 to 496 represented a period of consolidation and adaptation as the Vandal kingdom adjusted to changing Mediterranean conditions. One of Gunthamund's most significant policies was the relaxation of religious persecution. Understanding that Huneric's anti-Catholic campaigns had been counterproductive, Gunthamund allowed exiled bishops to return, reopened Catholic churches, and generally adopted a more tolerant approach to religious differences. However, new challenges were emerging. The Berber tribes of the interior, who had generally been kept in check through diplomacy and military pressure, began to pose more serious threats to Vandal territory. These conflicts required different military strategies than the naval operations that had been the kingdom's specialty. The Berber Wars revealed both the strengths and limitations of Vandal military organization. While Vandal forces remained effective in conventional battles, they struggled with the guerrilla tactics favored by Berber warriors. The vast distances of the African interior, combined with the mobility of Berber forces, made it difficult for the Vandals to achieve decisive victories. These internal conflicts also strained the kingdom's resources and diverted attention from Mediterranean operations. The need to maintain substantial military forces for frontier defense reduced the manpower available for naval operations, while the cost of prolonged campaigns affected the kingdom's financial stability. Gunthamund died in 496, and the succession of his brother Thrasimund marked another successful transition according to Gaiseric's inheritance system. Thrasimund would prove to be one of the most capable Vandal rulers after Gaiseric himself, combining military skill with diplomatic sophistication and cultural patronage. Thrasimund's reign from 496 to 523 represented the Vandal kingdom's final golden age, a period when skilled leadership temporarily overcame the structural challenges facing the state. One of his most important achievements was the restoration of Vandal naval supremacy in the Western Mediterranean through shipbuilding, recruitment, and strategic planning. The religious policies of Thrasimund returned to the systematic promotion of Arianism, but with greater sophistication than his predecessors. Rather than simply suppressing Catholic institutions, Thrasimund promoted Arian scholarship, built impressive Arian churches, and engaged in theological debates designed to demonstrate the superiority of Arian doctrine. Thrasimund's court became a center of theological learning that attracted scholars from throughout the Christian world. The king himself was reportedly well educated in theology, philosophy, and classical literature, making him an effective advocate for Arian positions in debates with Catholic intellectuals. The diplomatic achievements of Thrasimund's reign were particularly significant. His marriage to Amalafrida, sister of Ostrogothic King Theodoric the Great, created a powerful alliance between the two most successful barbarian kingdoms. This alliance provided the Vandals with security against Roman attack, while giving them influence in Italian affairs. Cultural life in the Vandal kingdom reached new heights during Thrasimund's reign. The king was a patron of learning and the arts, supporting scholars, poets, and artists who contributed to a distinctive Vandal cultural synthesis. Latin literature continued to flourish, while Germanic traditions remained strong among the Vandal elite. However, the underlying structural problems facing the Vandal kingdom continued to worsen despite Thrasimund's capable leadership. The kingdom's military forces were increasingly stretched between Mediterranean operations and African frontier defense. The economic costs of maintaining naval supremacy and territorial control were enormous. The demographic challenges facing the Vandal kingdom were also becoming apparent. The Vandal population remained relatively small compared to the Roman and Berber populations they ruled, making them dependent on military superiority and political skill to maintain control. Any weakening of these advantages could quickly become catastrophic. The death of Theodoric the Great in 526 and the subsequent weakening of the Ostrogothic kingdom eliminated one of the Vandals' most important allies. This loss left the Vandal kingdom increasingly isolated in the face of growing Byzantine pressure under the new Emperor Justinian I, who had ambitious plans for reconquering the lost western provinces. Thrasimund died in 523, and his death marked the beginning of the Vandal kingdom's final crisis. The succession of Hilderic, son of Honoric and the former imperial princess Eudocia, seemed to provide legitimacy and continuity, but Hilderic proved unable to maintain the military and diplomatic achievements of his predecessors. Hilderic's reign from 523 to 530 represented a dramatic reversal of traditional Vandal policies and priorities. Unlike his predecessors, who had maintained their independence through military strength and diplomatic skill, Hilderic sought accommodation with the Byzantine Empire and adopted policies that weakened traditional Vandal institutions. The religious policies of Hilderic marked a complete break with Vandal tradition. Rather than promoting Arianism, he favored Catholic Christianity and allowed the return of exiled Catholic bishops. While this policy improved relations with the Roman population, it alienated the Vandal elite and weakened one of the key markers of Vandal identity. Hilderic's military policies proved equally controversial. He reduced the size of the Vandal fleet and army, apparently believing that peaceful relations with Byzantium made large military forces unnecessary. This demilitarization weakened the kingdom's defensive capabilities while eliminating one of the primary sources of Vandal power and prestige. The growing opposition to Hilderic's policies culminated in 530 with a coup led by Gelimer, a member of the royal family who represented the traditional Vandal values that Hilderic had abandoned. Gelimer's overthrow of Hilderic provided Emperor Justinian with the pretext he needed for military intervention in Vandal Africa. Gelimer's brief reign from 530 to 534 represented a desperate attempt to restore traditional Vandal policies and prepare for the Byzantine invasion that everyone knew was coming. However, the damage done during Hilderic's reign had weakened the kingdom's defensive capabilities while providing Byzantium with both justification and opportunity for conquest. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Emperor Justinian I was planning one of the most ambitious military campaigns of the 6th century. Justinian had come to power in 527 with dreams of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory. The reconquest of the lost western provinces was central to these plans, and the Vandal kingdom, wealthy but apparently weakened, seemed like the perfect target for his first major campaign. Justinian's choice of Belisarius to lead the African expedition was inspired. Belisarius was young, ambitious, and had already demonstrated his capabilities in the Persian Wars. He was also politically reliable, unlikely to use military success to challenge imperial authority. Most importantly, he understood the kind of rapid, decisive campaign that would be necessary to defeat the Vandals before they could fully mobilize their resources. The Byzantine expedition that arrived in African waters in 533 was relatively small, consisting of perhaps 15,000 soldiers transported by 500 ships. But it was well-equipped, professionally trained, and led by one of the greatest generals of the age. More importantly, it benefited from careful intelligence gathering and local support from Romans who welcomed the prospect of Byzantine rule. Belisarius's African campaign represented one of the most successful military operations of the 6th century. The Byzantine general combined superior tactical skills with careful preparation and local intelligence to overcome the numerical and geographical advantages that should have favored the Vandals. The landing at Kapet Vada, modern-day Monastir in Tunisia, caught the Vandals off guard. Gelimer had expected the Byzantines to attack Carthage directly, and his forces were positioned accordingly. The unexpected landing site gave Belisarius the initiative and forced the Vandals to respond to Byzantine moves rather than implementing their own strategy. The Battle of Ad Decimum in September 533 resulted in a decisive Byzantine victory that shattered Vandal resistance and opened the road to Carthage. The battle was fought about 10 miles south of Carthage, at a place where the road split into multiple directions. Gelimer's plan was to coordinate attacks from multiple directions, but poor communication and timing allowed Belisarius to defeat the Vandal forces piecemeal. The victory at Ad Decimum was particularly devastating because it occurred so close to Carthage. News of the defeat created panic in the capital, while Gelimer's forced retreat left the city essentially defenseless. Many Vandal nobles began considering surrender or flight rather than continued resistance. Gelimer's forces, despite fighting bravely, were outmaneuvered and outfought by Belisarius's professionals. The Vandal king was forced to flee to the interior, leaving Carthage defenseless. The capture of Carthage by Byzantine forces marked the effective end of the Vandal kingdom. The city that had been the center of Vandal power for nearly a century fell without significant resistance. Its treasures and archives provided the Byzantines with both wealth and intelligence about Vandal capabilities and weaknesses. The great harbor that had launched 1,000 Vandal raids was now in Byzantine hands. Gelimer's attempts to continue resistance from the African interior proved futile. The Battle of Tricameron in December 533 resulted in another devastating defeat for Vandal forces. This battle, fought in the valley of the Bagradas River, was Gelimer's last attempt to gather sufficient forces to retake Carthage. The defeat at Tricameron was even more complete than ad decimum. Gelimer's brother Zazan, who had been fighting Berber rebels in Sardinia, had returned with reinforcements, giving the Vandals hope that they could reverse their fortunes. But Belisarius's tactical superiority proved decisive once again. After Tricameron, Gelimer fled to the mountains with a small band of followers, but his cause was clearly hopeless. The Vandal army had been shattered, the kingdom's treasury was in Byzantine hands, and most of the Vandal nobility had either been killed, captured, or had switched sides. The final act of the Vandal kingdom played out in the mountains of Numidia, where Gelimer took refuge among Berber allies. For months, he held out hope that circumstances might change, that other barbarian kingdoms might come to his aid, or that Byzantine forces might be recalled to deal with other threats. But Emperor Justinian was determined to complete the conquest, and he ordered Belisarius to finish the campaign. Byzantine forces surrounded Gelimer's mountain refuge, cutting off supplies and communications. Slowly, the former king's followers began to desert, seeking amnesty from the new rulers. The final capture of Gelimer in 534 ended the last vestiges of Vandal independence. According to the historian Procopius, who witnessed these events, Gelimer's surrender was a pitiful affair. The former king, reduced to skin and bones after months in the mountains, wept when he saw bread for the first time in months. Gelimer was taken to Constantinople, where he participated in Belisarius's triumph before being granted estates in Galatia, where he lived quietly until his death. His fate symbolized the complete transformation of the Vandals from conquerors to conquered. But the destruction of the Vandal kingdom was not just a military victory. It was the end of one of the most remarkable stories in ancient history. In little more than a century, the Vandals had traversed the entire breadth of the known world, establishing one of the most successful barbarian kingdoms and playing a crucial role in the transformation of the Mediterranean world. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the Vandal kingdom? First, their story demonstrates the incredible adaptability of human societies. The Vandals successfully transformed themselves multiple times, from Germanic tribesmen to migrating warriors, from raiders to rulers, from land-based peoples to naval powers, from barbarians to sophisticated administrators. This adaptability was their greatest strength, but it was also, in some ways, their weakness. Because they had changed so much during their migrations and conquests, later generations of Vandals sometimes lost touch with the qualities that had made their ancestors successful. The warrior culture that had sustained them during their migrations became less relevant once they established their African kingdom. The Vandal story also illustrates the importance of leadership in determining historical outcomes. Gaiseric's exceptional capabilities allowed the Vandals to achieve heights of power that might otherwise have been impossible. But the kingdom's dependence on strong individual leadership made it vulnerable when later rulers proved less capable. The religious dimension of Vandal history provides fascinating insights into how identity and politics intersected in the ancient world. The Vandal adoption of Arian Christianity served multiple purposes. It distinguished them from their Roman subjects, connected them to other Germanic kingdoms, and provided a unifying ideology for their diverse confederation. But this religious choice also created ongoing tensions that weakened the kingdom over time. The persecution of Catholics under some Vandal rulers strengthened Roman resistance while providing enemies with propaganda ammunition. The eventual abandonment of Arianism under Hilderic contributed to the political divisions that made Byzantine conquest possible. The economic achievements of the Vandal kingdom were perhaps their most lasting legacy. Their transformation of Carthage into a major trading center, their development of Mediterranean commercial networks, and their agricultural innovations in North Africa created changes that persisted long after the kingdom's destruction. Recent archaeological work has revealed that North Africa under Vandal rule was actually a time of continued economic prosperity rather than decline. The discovery of extensive Vandal period settlements, irrigation systems, and trading posts suggests that the kingdom was more economically successful than traditional historical accounts had suggested. The military innovations of the Vandal kingdom, particularly their development of naval power, influenced medieval warfare and exploration. Their integration of different ethnic groups into effective military units provided models for later medieval armies, while their siege techniques and fortification methods were adopted throughout the Mediterranean world. Perhaps most importantly, the Vandal kingdom demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of barbarian state-building in the post-Roman world. Their success showed that Germanic peoples could create sophisticated political institutions, govern complex societies, and compete effectively with the Roman Empire itself. Their eventual failure illustrated the challenges of maintaining such achievements over multiple generations. The kingdom that Gaiseric built through personal genius and exceptional circumstances proved difficult to sustain when those circumstances changed and later rulers lacked his exceptional capabilities. The story of the Vandals also reflects the broader transformation of the ancient world during the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. Their migrations, conquests, and state-building efforts were part of the larger process that transformed the Roman world into medieval Europe and the Byzantine Empire. The end of the Vandal kingdom marked not just the conclusion of their particular story, but also the end of the great age of barbarian migrations that had reshaped the Western world. Future barbarian groups would face different conditions and opportunities, while the surviving Roman and Byzantine institutions had learned from their encounters with peoples like the Vandals. In many ways, the Vandals were victims of their own success. Their transformation of the Mediterranean world created new conditions that made their particular combination of skills and circumstances less advantageous. The naval supremacy that had made them powerful became less significant as trade patterns changed. The political fragmentation that they had exploited was gradually being overcome by stronger, more centralized states. The final irony of Vandal history is that their greatest achievement, the creation of a stable barbarian kingdom in Africa, also contained the seeds of their destruction. By becoming successful rulers of a settled population, they gradually lost the mobility and flexibility that had been their greatest advantages during their migrations. The Vandal legacy extends far beyond their military and political achievements. Their cultural contributions, though often overlooked, were significant. The synthesis of Germanic, Roman, and Christian traditions that developed in their kingdom influenced medieval culture throughout the former Roman world. Archaeological evidence from Vandal sites reveals a sophisticated material culture that combined Germanic artistic traditions with Roman technical skills and Christian symbolism. Vandal jewelry, weapons, and religious artifacts demonstrate a unique aesthetic that reflected their complex cultural heritage. The linguistic legacy of the Vandals is more difficult to trace, but evidence suggests that Germanic words entered Latin dialects throughout their territories, contributing to the development of medieval Romance languages. Place names throughout North Africa and southern Europe preserve traces of Vandal settlement and influence. The legal innovations of the Vandal kingdom were particularly important. Their development of dual legal systems that allowed different populations to follow their own legal traditions provided models for medieval kingdoms throughout Europe. The idea that different ethnic groups within a single kingdom could maintain their own legal customs became a standard feature of medieval governance. The administrative achievements of the Vandal kingdom influenced medieval statecraft in numerous ways. Their integration of Roman bureaucratic practices with Germanic leadership structures created hybrid forms of government that were adopted by other barbarian kingdoms. The Vandal approach to taxation, military organization, and diplomatic relations provided templates for medieval rulers. Perhaps most significantly, the Vandal kingdom demonstrated that barbarian peoples could successfully compete with the Roman Empire not just militarily, but also culturally and economically. Their merchants traded throughout the known world, their scholars contributed to learning and literature, and their artisans created works that rivaled those of Constantinople and Ravenna. The failure of the Vandal kingdom was not due to any inherent barbarism or inability to govern. Instead, it resulted from the same kinds of political, military, and economic challenges that faced all states in the ancient world. Succession disputes, external threats, internal rebellions, and economic pressures were problems that even the Roman Empire had struggled to manage. What made the Vandal failure particularly tragic was that it occurred just as they seemed to be overcoming many of these challenges. Under Thrasimund, the kingdom had achieved a level of stability and prosperity that suggested it might survive indefinitely. The rapid collapse under his successors demonstrates how quickly political situations could change in the ancient world. The Byzantine conquest of the Vandal kingdom was itself short-lived. Within a few decades, much of North Africa had been lost to Arab conquest, and the Byzantine gains proved temporary. This suggests that the destruction of the Vandal kingdom may have actually weakened rather than strengthened long-term stability in the region. Some historians have argued that a continued Vandal kingdom might have provided more effective resistance to later invasions. The Vandals had demonstrated their ability to integrate different populations and adapt to changing circumstances. Their knowledge of local conditions and their established relationships with Berber tribes might have made them more effective defenders than distant Byzantine administrators. The story of individual Vandals after the conquest provides fascinating glimpses into how people adapted to the destruction of their world. Some Vandal nobles were incorporated into the Byzantine administration, using their local knowledge and administrative experience to serve new masters. Others fled to other barbarian kingdoms, particularly the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, where their skills were valued and their experience was respected. Many ordinary Vandals simply remained in North Africa, gradually assimilating into the broader population. Archaeological evidence suggests that Vandal communities continued to exist for generations after the conquest, maintaining some of their traditional practices while adapting to new political realities. The fate of Vandal women provides particularly interesting insights into the aftermath of conquest. Because Vandal women had enjoyed more rights and freedoms than their Roman counterparts, the Byzantine conquest represented a significant loss of status for many. Some adapted by converting to Orthodox Christianity and integrating into Roman society, while others maintained Germanic traditions within their families and communities. The religious dimension of the post-conquest period was complex. While Arian Christianity largely disappeared from North Africa after the Byzantine conquest, some Arian communities persisted in remote areas for several generations. The theological works produced by Arian scholars during the Vandal period continued to influence Christian thought, even among Orthodox theologians who opposed Arian doctrine. Recent archaeological discoveries have provided new insights into the material culture of the post-conquest period. Excavations at Carthage and other former Vandal sites reveal evidence of cultural continuity alongside political change. Many crafts, artistic traditions, and building techniques that had developed during the Vandal period continued under Byzantine rule. The numismatic evidence from this period is particularly revealing. Coins minted during the early years of Byzantine rule often featured imagery and symbolism that clearly derived from Vandal traditions, suggesting that the new rulers recognized the need to appeal to former Vandal subjects. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Vandal kingdom was its demonstration that the barbarian migrations were not simply destructive invasions, but complex processes of cultural exchange and political transformation. The Vandals didn't just destroy Roman civilization in Africa, they transformed it, creating new forms of government, new cultural syntheses, and new economic relationships. This transformation was part of the broader process that historians now call the transformation of the Roman world, rather than the fall of the Roman Empire. The Vandals were active participants in this transformation, contributing their own traditions and innovations to the emerging medieval world. The military techniques developed by the Vandals, particularly their naval innovations, continued to influence Mediterranean warfare for centuries. Their use of fire ships, their development of raiding tactics, and their integration of different types of warriors into unified forces provided models for later naval powers. The diplomatic practices of the Vandal kingdom also had lasting influence. Their use of marriage alliances, their treaty-making procedures, and their balance between cooperation and competition with other powers became standard features of medieval international relations. The economic innovations of the Vandal period were equally significant. Their development of trade networks that connected North Africa with Europe, their agricultural techniques adapted to African conditions, and their urban planning in cities like Carthage influenced medieval development throughout the Mediterranean. The cultural achievements of the Vandal kingdom, though often overshadowed by their military reputation, were substantial. The literature, art, and scholarship produced during their reign contributed to the intellectual foundations of medieval civilization. Their synthesis of different cultural traditions created new forms of expression that enriched the broader human heritage. As we reach the end of this remarkable story, it's worth reflecting on what the Vandals accomplished and what their legacy means for our understanding of history. They began as a Germanic tribe living in the forests of northern Europe, little different from dozens of other similar groups. Through a combination of circumstances, leadership, and adaptability, they transformed themselves into one of the most powerful kingdoms of their age. Their journey took them across the entire known world, from the Baltic shores to the African deserts. Along the way, they encountered countless other peoples, learned from numerous cultures, and adapted to environments ranging from frozen rivers to Mediterranean islands to African cities. They proved that barbarian peoples could build sophisticated states, govern complex societies, and compete successfully with the greatest powers of their time. They demonstrated that cultural identity could be maintained even while adopting new technologies, new ideas, and new ways of life. But they also showed the challenges and limitations that faced all human societies in the ancient world. Despite their remarkable achievements, they could not overcome the fundamental problems of succession, internal division, external pressure, and generational change that affected all ancient kingdoms. The Vandal story is ultimately a human story, about people who faced impossible challenges and achieved remarkable things. It's about warriors who became kings, nomads who became rulers of cities, and barbarians who became builders of civilization. Their legacy reminds us that history is not simply the account of great empires and established civilizations, but also the story of those who challenged, changed, and ultimately replaced them. The Vandals prove that even the mightiest empires must eventually give way to new forms of organization and new expressions of human ambition. From their origins in the Germanic forests to their final kingdom on African shores, the Vandals traveled not just across geography, but across the entire spectrum of human possibility. They left behind a legacy that continues to inspire and instruct us about the enduring human capacity for transformation, achievement, and transcendence of our origins. Their story teaches us that adaptation and innovation are more powerful than tradition and conservatism, that cultural flexibility is more valuable than ethnic purity, and that political intelligence can be more effective than military strength alone. But it also reminds us that even the most successful adaptations are temporary, and that all human achievements must eventually give way to new challenges and new opportunities. The Vandals succeeded because they embraced change while maintaining their core identity. They failed because they could not sustain this balance across multiple generations. Their story is both inspiring and cautionary, showing us both what humans can achieve and the limitations that constrain all human endeavors. In the end, the Vandals were neither the mindless destroyers that their name suggests, nor the heroic conquerors that some romanticized accounts have portrayed. They were people, complex and contradictory, who found themselves caught up in the great currents of historical change, and who shaped those currents through their choices, their courage, and their remarkable ability to adapt to new circumstances. Their journey from the Germanic forests to the African shores remains one of history's most remarkable adventures, a testament to human adaptability, ambition, and the complex processes that shape the rise and fall of civilizations. The Vandal kings, from the legendary early leaders who guided the great migrations to Gaiseric the Conqueror, to the tragic final rulers who presided over the kingdom's destruction, created a legacy that continues to fascinate and inform our understanding of one of history's most dynamic periods. As we look back across the centuries at their extraordinary story, we can see in the Vandals something of ourselves. People struggling to build better lives for their children, adapting to changing circumstances, and creating new possibilities from the materials at hand. The Vandal legacy extended far beyond the political boundaries of their defunct kingdom. In the monasteries of Ireland and the scriptoriums of Francia, monks continued copying manuscripts that had been preserved in Vandal libraries. These texts, many of which would have been lost forever during the chaotic collapse of Roman authority, survived because Vandal rulers had valued learning and maintained the scholarly traditions they inherited from Rome. Archaeological evidence continues to emerge that challenges our understanding of the post-Vandal period. Excavations at sites throughout North Africa reveal that many communities maintained distinctly Vandal cultural practices well into the 7th and 8th centuries, long after the Byzantine conquest and even after the arrival of Arab armies. Burial practices, household arrangements, and craft traditions show remarkable continuity despite the dramatic political changes that swept over the region. The genetic legacy of the Vandals presents fascinating puzzles for modern researchers. DNA studies of North African populations have revealed traces of Northern European ancestry that likely dates to the Vandal period, suggesting that significant numbers of Germanic settlers remained in the region and intermarried with local populations. These genetic markers can be found from Morocco to Tunisia, following roughly the same coastal distribution as the former Vandal territories. Perhaps even more intriguing is the discovery of similar genetic markers in unexpected places. Recent studies have identified what may be Vandal genetic signatures in populations along the Spanish coast, in southern Italy, and even in some Greek islands. These findings suggest that the Vandal diaspora after 534 was more extensive and complex than historical sources indicate, with former Vandal subjects and soldiers scattering throughout the Mediterranean world. The linguistic evidence for Vandal influence is subtle but persistent. While the Germanic language of the Vandals largely disappeared from North Africa, borrowed words and place names continued to influence local dialects. The Berber languages of the Atlas Mountains contain several dozen words that linguists believe derive from Germanic sources, most likely from contact with Vandal settlers and administrators. More surprisingly, some of these linguistic borrowings made their way into Arabic during the early centuries of Islamic expansion. When Arab armies conquered North Africa, they encountered populations that had been shaped by nearly 2 centuries of Vandal rule. Local guides, interpreters, and administrators who had served under Byzantine and Vandal masters brought their knowledge and vocabulary into the new Islamic administration. The technological innovations of the Vandal period proved remarkably durable. Agricultural techniques developed to maximize crop yields in the challenging African environment continued to be used by successive rulers. The irrigation systems built and expanded under Vandal rule provided the foundation for agricultural prosperity that lasted well into the medieval period. Vandal innovations in shipbuilding and navigation had even more far-reaching consequences. The design modifications they developed for Mediterranean sailing vessels were adopted throughout the region, influencing everything from Byzantine dromons to Arab trading ships. Their techniques for coastal navigation and their knowledge of seasonal wind patterns were passed down through generations of sailors, regardless of their political allegiances. The architectural legacy of the Vandal kingdom presents a complex picture of cultural synthesis. While many Vandal buildings were destroyed or modified by later rulers, archaeological investigation has revealed distinctive architectural elements that reflect the unique position of Vandal culture. Their buildings combined Roman engineering with Germanic decorative traditions and practical adaptations to African conditions. The Great Palace at Carthage, for instance, incorporated Roman architectural forms with Germanic hall-building traditions and innovative cooling systems adapted to the African climate. While the palace itself was largely demolished after the Byzantine conquest, archaeological traces reveal a sophisticated complex that demonstrated Vandal ability to create new forms appropriate to their circumstances. Religious architecture from the Vandal period shows similar innovation. Arian churches built during their rule featured distinctive design elements that differed from both traditional Roman churches and Germanic religious buildings. These structures reflected theological differences while adapting to local building materials and construction techniques. The fate of Vandal religious texts provides insight into the complex process of cultural transmission after conquest. While most Arian theological works were destroyed or hidden after the Byzantine reconquest, some survived in unexpected places. Fragments of Vandal Aryan texts have been discovered in medieval manuscripts from Spain, suggesting that some Vandal clergy fled west after the conquest and continued their scholarly activities in Visigothic territories. The artistic traditions of the Vandal kingdom created a distinctive aesthetic that influenced medieval art throughout the Mediterranean. Vandal metalworkers developed unique decorative techniques that combined Germanic animal styles with Roman classical motifs and Christian symbolism. Examples of this distinctive art have been found from Spain to Egypt, indicating the wide distribution of Vandal cultural influence. Vandal jewelry, in particular, demonstrates the sophisticated cultural synthesis that characterized their kingdom. Brooches, rings, and other ornamental items found in Vandal graves combine Germanic symbolic elements with Roman technical skills and African materials. The use of local gemstones, combined with traditional Germanic gold-working techniques and Roman-influenced designs, created objects that were uniquely Vandal while drawing from multiple cultural traditions. The economic networks established during the Vandal period proved remarkably resilient. Trade routes that connected North African ports with European markets continued to function long after the kingdom's destruction. The commercial relationships built by Vandal merchants provided the foundation for medieval Mediterranean trade, even as political control shifted from Vandals to Byzantines to Arabs. Documents from Egyptian papyri reveal that Vandal merchants maintained trading relationships throughout the eastern Mediterranean well into the 6th century. These traders adapted to changing political conditions by developing new partnerships and modifying their operations, but they continued to serve as crucial links in the commercial networks that connected Africa with the broader Mediterranean economy. The survival of these commercial networks was facilitated by the Vandal development of standardized weights, measures, and commercial practices that were adopted throughout their territories. These standards continued to be used by local merchants even after the conquest, providing continuity in commercial relationships despite political upheaval. Banking and credit arrangements developed during the Vandal period also showed remarkable persistence. The kingdom had developed sophisticated financial instruments that allowed merchants to operate across long distances without carrying large amounts of precious metals. These techniques were adopted by Byzantine and Arab administrators, who recognized their practical value regardless of their political origins. The legal legacy of the Vandal kingdom influenced medieval jurisprudence in ways that are only now being fully appreciated. The Vandal approach to governing diverse populations through multiple legal systems provided a model for medieval rulers throughout Europe. The concept that different ethnic and religious groups could maintain their own legal traditions within a unified kingdom became a standard feature of medieval governance. Vandal legal innovations were particularly influential in areas of commercial law and property rights. Their development of legal procedures for international trade, their regulations governing different types of property ownership, and their approaches to dispute resolution were adopted by later rulers who recognized their practical effectiveness. The influence of Vandal legal thinking can be traced in medieval law codes throughout Europe. Elements of Vandal legal procedure appear in Visigothic law, in early Frankish legal texts, and even in some Byzantine legal compilations. These influences reflect the practical value of Vandal innovations rather than any ideological preference for Germanic legal traditions. Marriage and family law developed under Vandal rule had particularly lasting influence. The relatively high status accorded to women in Vandal society, combined with Roman legal traditions and Christian moral teaching, created hybrid legal systems that influenced family law throughout medieval Europe. Educational practices in the Vandal kingdom created a generation of scholars who preserved and transmitted classical learning despite the political chaos of their time. Vandal schools maintained Latin literary traditions while adapting them to Germanic cultural values and Christian theological frameworks. The scholars trained in these institutions continued their work long after the kingdom's destruction, carrying Vandal educational approaches to new environments. The library at Carthage, expanded and enriched during the Vandal period, became legendary among medieval scholars. While many of its manuscripts were scattered after the Byzantine conquest, others found their way to libraries throughout Europe and the Middle East. Medieval catalogs from monasteries in Ireland, Francia, and even distant Byzantium include works that can be traced back to the Vandal royal library. The scholarly network that developed around Vandal courts continued to function even after 534. Scholars who had served Vandal kings found new patrons among Ostrogothic rulers, Frankish nobles, and even Byzantine administrators. Their knowledge and experience proved valuable regardless of political changes, and they served as crucial links in the transmission of classical learning to medieval European culture. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge preserved in Vandal schools had particularly significant influence on medieval learning. Vandal scholars had maintained and developed Roman mathematical traditions while incorporating new knowledge gained through contact with various Mediterranean cultures. Their work provided crucial foundations for the mathematical renaissance that would characterize later medieval scholarship. Medical knowledge preserved and developed during the Vandal period continued to influence medical practice throughout the Mediterranean for centuries. Vandal physicians had combined Roman medical traditions with Germanic herbal knowledge and medical techniques learned from various cultures they encountered during their migrations. This synthesis created distinctive medical practices that proved valuable to later practitioners. Veterinary medicine, crucial for the pastoral economies that characterized much of medieval Europe, was particularly influenced by Vandal innovations. Their experience managing livestock during their long migrations had taught them techniques for animal care that were superior to traditional Roman practices. These techniques were adopted throughout medieval Europe, contributing to improved agricultural productivity. Agricultural innovations developed during the Vandal period had even more lasting influence. The kingdom's success in adapting Mediterranean agricultural techniques to African conditions created new approaches that remained valuable long after the political structure that developed them had disappeared. Crop rotation systems developed during the Vandal period proved particularly durable. Their techniques for maintaining soil fertility in challenging environments were adopted by Byzantine and later Arab administrators, who recognized their practical value. Some of these techniques continue to influence North African agriculture even today. Water management innovations from the Vandal period had enormous long-term influence. Their development of irrigation systems, well drilling techniques, and water storage methods provided the technological foundation for agricultural prosperity that lasted well into the medieval period. Many of these systems continued to function under Byzantine and Arab rule, testament to the practical skills of Vandal engineers. The integration of different agricultural traditions during the Vandal period created new approaches that proved remarkably successful. Germanic farming techniques, adapted to Mediterranean conditions and combined with Roman agricultural knowledge and African environmental understanding, produced innovations that influenced medieval agriculture throughout southern Europe. Urban planning innovations from the Vandal period influenced medieval city development in ways that are only now being fully understood. Vandal approaches to organizing diverse urban populations, managing city services, and maintaining public order provided models that were adopted by later rulers throughout the Mediterranean. The Vandal development of harbor facilities and port administration proved particularly influential. Their innovations in dock construction, warehouse management, and commercial regulation were adopted by Byzantine and Arab administrators who recognized their practical effectiveness. Many Mediterranean ports continued to use organizational systems developed during the Vandal period well into the medieval era. Public health measures developed during the Vandal period had lasting influence on medieval urban planning. Their approaches to sanitation, water supply, and waste management reflected practical experience gained during their migrations and adapted to the challenges of governing large urban populations. These techniques proved valuable to later administrators regardless of their political origins. The social innovations of the Vandal kingdom influenced medieval European society in complex and subtle ways. Their development of systems for integrating diverse populations, managing cultural differences, and maintaining social order in multi-ethnic kingdoms provided models that proved valuable throughout medieval Europe. Military innovations from the Vandal period had profound influence on medieval warfare. Their development of combined arms tactics, their integration of cavalry and infantry forces, and their innovations in siege warfare influenced military development throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. Naval warfare techniques developed by the Vandals proved particularly influential. Their innovations in ship design, naval tactics, and amphibious operations influenced medieval naval development throughout the Mediterranean. The Byzantine navy, which conquered the Vandal kingdom, incorporated many Vandal innovations into their own practices. The Vandal approach to logistics and supply management proved remarkably influential on later military development. Their techniques for managing supplies during long campaigns, their methods for organizing military transportation, and their approaches to maintaining army cohesion over extended periods were adopted by medieval commanders throughout Europe. Fortification techniques developed during the Vandal period influenced medieval military architecture. Their innovations in defensive design, their approaches to siege defense, and their integration of different fortification traditions created new approaches that proved valuable to later military engineers. The diplomatic innovations of the Vandal kingdom influenced international relations throughout the medieval period. Their techniques for negotiating with multiple powers simultaneously, their approaches to treaty-making, and their methods for managing alliance relationships provided models that proved valuable to later medieval rulers. Marriage diplomacy, perfected during the Vandal period, became a standard tool of medieval international relations. The Vandal development of techniques for using dynastic marriages to cement political alliances influenced diplomatic practice throughout medieval Europe. Trade diplomacy, another Vandal innovation, proved equally influential. Their development of techniques for using commercial relationships to support political objectives influenced medieval economic policy throughout the Mediterranean. The integration of commercial and political considerations in international relations became a hallmark of medieval diplomacy. The Vandal approach to managing relationships with diverse cultural groups proved particularly valuable to later medieval rulers. Their techniques for maintaining political authority while respecting cultural differences provided models for governing the complex multi-ethnic kingdoms that characterized medieval Europe. As centuries passed and the immediate memory of the Vandal kingdom faded, their influence became embedded in the fundamental structures of medieval civilization. The techniques they developed, the innovations they created, and the solutions they found to complex problems became part of the common heritage of medieval European society. The very success of this cultural integration meant that the Vandal contribution to medieval civilization became invisible to later generations. Their innovations were so thoroughly adopted and adapted that they seemed like natural developments rather than the specific achievements of a particular people and kingdom. Modern archaeological and historical research is only beginning to reveal the full extent of Vandal influence on medieval development. As new evidence emerges from excavations throughout the Mediterranean, the picture of Vandal achievement becomes more complex and more impressive. Recent discoveries at sites from Spain to Egypt have revealed evidence of Vandal cultural influence that persisted long after their political power ended. These findings suggest that the Vandal legacy was far more extensive and durable than traditional historical accounts have suggested. The story of the Vandals thus becomes not just the account of a single kingdom's rise and fall, but part of the larger story of how medieval European civilization developed from the fusion of Roman, Germanic, Christian, and other cultural traditions. Their contribution to this fusion was significant and lasting, even if it became invisible to later generations who inherited the results of their innovations. Understanding the full extent of Vandal influence requires us to look beyond traditional political narratives to examine the complex processes of cultural transmission and adaptation that characterize the transformation of the ancient world into medieval European civilization. The Vandals were active participants in this transformation, and their legacy continues to influence our world in ways both subtle and profound. From their origins as Germanic warriors in the forests of northern Europe to their final role as contributors to the cultural foundations of medieval civilization, the Vandals traveled not just across geography, but across the entire spectrum of human possibility. Their journey ended not with destruction, but with transformation, not with failure, but with integration into the continuing human story that connects their world to ours.